Great. So thank you very much for attending the Roundtable Governance organized by the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association. I'm going to go through the panelists here in a second and their organizations, but I'll begin with the land acknowledgement from the University of Lethbridge. The University of Lethbridge is located in traditional Blackfoot Confederacy territory. We honor the Blackfoot people and their traditional ways of knowing in caring for this land, as well as all Aboriginal peoples who have helped shape and continue to strengthen our university community. We have for this roundtable 4 speakers, 4 panelists who will begin by making a few brief remarks just on their thoughts on governance, and then we'll go through a series of questions that are designed to provoke discussion on issues that seem of relevance to begin the discussion. We'll also open up after that the discussion to members of the audience. You can put up a hand and be recognized. Carl will be handling that. Can ask questions of the hosts and the panelists using the chat, or I guess the Q&A function, and we will stay on top of those as well. But if you want to speak, I think we can put up a hand and then we can open up your microphone and camera as well. As I said, we've got 4 panelists. I'm going to read a brief introduction about each of them. It's a random order for this. The first that I'll Schroeder is an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics and Computing at Mount Royal University in Calgary, where he's taught since 2002. Marc has been engaged in both academic union and university governance work for much of this time. He's served on the Mount Royal Faculty Association Executive Board, including as president in 2014 to 2018, served on the executive committee of the Canadian Association of University Teachers in 2018 to 2021, and he currently co-chairs CAUT's governance committee. At Mount Royal, his governance experience includes serving on the GFC Executive Committee and having led the committee that developed Mount Royal's promotion and tenure criteria. Robin Whitaker is an associate professor of anthropology at Memorial University of Newfoundland and vice president of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, CAUT. Her research centers on political and public anthropology with a regional focus in Northern Ireland and Newfoundland and Labrador. She also serves as co-chair of the CAUT Governance Committee and is a board member and occasional columnist for Newfoundland and Labrador independent news media outlet, The Independent. Jeff Keshen is president and vice. Before becoming president in 2021, he served 3.5 years as vice president of Memorial University's Grenfell campus in Corner Brook, Newfoundland and Labrador. Prior to that role, he served as Dean of Faculty of Arts at Mount Royal University in Calgary. He's previously served as the chair of the Department of History at the University of Ottawa and was an adjunct professor in the Center for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. In his administrative work, he's focused on improving institutional connections with surrounding communities and supporting students, faculty, and staff through various initiatives, including supports for vulnerable and Indigenous students and programs to enrich academic employment. His academic work has focused on the history of war and conflict. Jeff Hennessey is Provost and Vice President, Academic and Research at Mount Allison University. Prior to arriving at Mount Allison in 2020, he spent 5 years as Dean of Arts at Acadia University and 6 years as the Director of the School of Music there prior to becoming Dean. Dr. Hennessey's academic work is focused on musicology and music performance. He has a PhD in interdisciplinary musicology from the University of Toronto and balances being an administrator with work as a songwriter, composer, keyboardist, whose work has been featured throughout North America. And there are 2 programs and additional events that I want to flag for people coming up from our panelists who are very, very active in these issues. The first is that the Canadian Association of University Teachers Governance Committee, which is chaired by Robin and Marc, will be running a national governance campaign. It's planned to launch in March. It will have a number of events, and it will also compile a national permanent library and resource for CAUT member faculty associations. And at the University of Regina, they are planning a conference, What Are Universities For?, which will run from May 4th to 6th, 2023. And that's part of a larger project, and you can read more about it at the URL, whatareuniversitiesfor.ca. My name is Dan O'Donnell. I'm the president of the University of Lethbridge Faculty Association. I'm a professor of medieval English, digital humanities, and scholarly communication. I'm currently running a number of projects involving the study of the research enterprise, particularly the humanities and particularly in relation to open science. As a member of the ULFA executive, I was chief negotiator for several rounds of bargaining, and I had the pleasure and also the pain of being the president through a 6-week strike and lockout last spring. This panel is part of a year-long process, a year-long campaign that we have started about working for a better university, where we're looking at how university is run, preparing for the future of the University of Lethbridge, but also universities across Canada, more importantly, as we come out of the pandemic times. With that, I'll just hand things over to the panelists for initial remarks. And again, we've got them in a random order, I believe. The order that we'll go through is Jeff Keshen, Robin Whitaker, Jeff Hennessey, and Marc Schroeder. And just before I start, I did forget, I actually meant to thank one other person who's not able to be here, and that is Deb Saucier, who had originally agreed to be part of this panel. She is a former faculty member here who's gone on to other universities, but was unfortunately forced to withdraw due to an emergent issue at her university. And so I want to thank her for the participation and the thinking that she put into this panel, and also say that we're going to miss her experience both as a woman university president and as an Indigenous university president.
Great to see everybody. And I'll also start with the acknowledgement that the University of Regina is in Treaty 4 territory, and our social work and nursing faculties in Saskatoon are located in Treaty 6. And these are the traditional homelands of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaabe, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis and Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of diverse peoples from near and from far. I was asked 3 questions. I'll just go to the first one and as an opener, which first question I received is there a governance crisis in Canadian post-secondary education? Why or why not? What's working well and what's working poorly? So I can only speak right now from the perspective of the University of Regina, and I would say that we do not have a governance crisis with respect to our 2 governing bodies, and that's our Board of Governors and our Senate. Our board has its boundaries of oversight set out clearly in what's called the University of Regina Act. It is an outdated document, it goes back to 1974, but it's the terms under the University of Regina Act. And as a collective, as individuals, they know that strategic direction and financial oversight are their primary areas of responsibility. We're talking about strategic direction, that's very high level, and that's set by the president and the executive in consultation with colleagues. Of course, our board meetings, we have rich discussions about many aspects of our university's operational matters. That's inevitable, it bleeds into that sometimes. And they provide advice in this regard. But I will say from my experience, this group of volunteers really doesn't overstep its bounds. They do bring wide variety of expertise to the university, but in doing so, they recognize that the operational decisions are for the university administration to make. Now, as the folks online will know, I am the only employee of the board, really. So my relationship with them is important. I personally meet with the board chair and the vice chair every 2 weeks. And I do so when I was interviewing for this job, I made the point to say, I look at them as just excellent sources of advice. I need that advice. I contact them regularly to bounce ideas off them. And in some instances where an issue might have strong community impact, call the board together. In such instances, they have advised, but not dictated courses on action. As community members, they open the door, and they have opened the door for me to the wider world, Regina. I didn't know a lot of folks here, helping me make important connections that might otherwise not be made. Our board chair, Marlene Smedu, is not silent. She's not an invisible person in the university community. And I think that's very important. She regularly writes to faculty and staff, such as to congratulate them on their accomplishments. She attends athletic events with her own personalized journey and jersey and other activities. The more that she interacts with people and our board interacts with people, the more familiar and comfortable they are with her and other members of the board. And it's important that our colleagues never see the board as some type of dark and secretive star chamber. Our researchers often make presentations to the board about their work because it's great for the board to have a good idea about the work they are helping to facilitate. It's also of note that our student union president is always a full member of the board, ensuring that our students remain top of mind. And we do have a faculty representative on our board as well. And maybe I'll just segue up at the end of this comment, just to say, maybe skip for the third one. On the academic side, our executive council, we have an executive council. It really functions like Marc would be aware, like the General Faculties Council at other institutions, or as Robin would know from MUN, it functions like the Senate. It is a subset of our full university council, which every professor is a part of. And the full university council meets very infrequently. They haven't met since I've been here because of its sheer size, but we will, for example, take it to our full university council when we bring forward our new academic plan. Academic decisions at our university proceed through our executive council to the final stop, which is our university Senate. And Senate has a lot of ex officio members, deans and so forth, but also members from provincial organizations and districts across our province to get broad representation of community members. I wouldn't say that it's a rubber stamp, but it kind of functions like the Senate of Canada as a sort of a sober second thought or final thought decisions that are far along. And when the Senate meets, I always do tell them about our operational things that may be of concern, but actually not formally part of their jurisdiction. I want to inform them about our budget, want to inform them what's going on, just like I do at EOC. I think that fundamentally familiarity with the folks, transparency is the key, and it works well. I just will say, because I think that maybe I won't have time to go all three, but we were thinking about what could improve and perhaps a little bit more transparency. We were considering this on what our faculty member on the board can report on. And we thought about, well, he, she, or they're not allowed to provide details of what we discussed, but perhaps, and my comments, the boards are always printed in full for our colleagues to look at. But perhaps that member could say that we did discuss this, due process was considered, so people would know the issues are being brought up. But with that, I'll defer it to other colleagues to offer some opening comments. So thanks so much.
Speaking from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, which has several campuses in the province, and they are on the traditional territories of the Innu of Nitassinan, the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuavut, as well as on the island portion of the province, the Mi'kmaq. So I just wanted to acknowledge where I am. So I'll start by just thanking ULFA for organizing this event. I'm really pleased about being able to participate. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion, and I'm sure I'm going to learn a great deal from other participants, both on the panel and discussion afterwards. I'm primarily speaking from the CAUT vantage point. I did just, if anyone's interested in what's happening at Memorial, I did just write a commentary piece on governance at Memorial in the Independent, which was mentioned in my bio. So it's easy to find, or I can share it later. So I'll say that from my vantage point in CAUT, collegial governance is a hot topic right now. And I think that reflects not only widespread frustration and, you know, in reference to, I miss Jeff Keshen from at Memorial, but, you know, he's spoken about some things that are going well. Of course, we hear about the problems more than we hear about what's going well, but we certainly are hearing a lot of frustration, but also the flip side of that, a collective commitment among academic staff across the country to contribute positively to the academic mission of public post-secondary education through governance. Secondly, I'll just give away a little bit of my approach to the specific questions that we're going to discuss following this by saying that I believe that collegial governance matters as such, and it matters a lot. But I also believe we need to understand it in conjunction with a host of other issues that might not on the face of it appear to be about governance. So these include such issues as funding models for public post-secondary education, but also our commitments to the wider social welfare state, ideological questions about the public good, and our ability to see ourselves as part of a wider labor movement, for those of us speaking from the union side. So in short, true collegiality will allow us to contribute to the vital issues in our institutions, but we will also help create the conditions needed for effective shared governance by seeing our work in a wider scene. And in this sense, while it will be clear that I think we're facing many problems, when we get to the question about crisis, I'm also going to argue that there are good reasons to think outside a crisis framework.
Zooming into you from the beautiful campus of Mount Allison University, which is on unceded Mi'kmaq territory, under our treaties here of peace and friendship, which were established in the early 1700s. And I'm delighted to be with you virtually, as this is a topic I am personally actually very passionate about, and I believe this discussion to be timely, I think for obvious reasons. I personally think collegial governance is one of the most important and unique aspects of universities, but perhaps almost also one of the most misunderstood maybe concepts in my opinion. And I think that's a good place to start for me. I'm going to give you my thoughts on collegial governance, which have been formed over 23 years working in higher ed as a faculty member and administrator, what it means to me, what it doesn't, with the proviso that these are my opinions, and I don't think they're very original ones, but they're still ones that I'm going to offer today, and you can agree or disagree with them. And I think that's the first thing that's important to distinguish regarding collegial governance, because it actually doesn't mean I govern and then you act collegially. Certainly, we can hope and even insist that we be kind and generous and respectful to each other in our interactions, but collegial governance has nothing really to do with collegiality as a noun implying respectful and agreeable discourse. We can have that expectation of each other, that we act professionally and with civility. I don't think this precludes passion. I think passion very much has a place in our discourse, but the collegial in collegial governance refers to the college or collegium of scholars who have a significant role to play in the governance of the institution, particularly around academic policy and the academic direction, and hence the mission or the purpose or the cause of the university. And this means that the faculty, academic staff play a key role in that process. And we were talking earlier, this isn't easy or straightforward, and it's important to realize that collegial governance is not a natural recipe for equity or diversity, since the loudest and most privileged voices, like mine, can and often still dominate our debate. So it's important that both administrators and faculty and unions ensure that collegial governance processes incorporate plurality of voices and positions, and not just the loud and the privileged few. But collegial governance is not just a nicety, or even I think a bargained right, which I'll get to in a minute. I think it's a necessity to maintain the longevity of the institution. Universities are not companies, for example, that get built and then grow to a point where they get sold off to make shareholders rich. They're built to be enduring institutions, what Simon Sinek calls the infinite game, or why we must work together to keep the institution going and ultimately thriving into perpetuity. And ideally, our academic leaders would have this mindset, and I actually think many of us do. I'm sure my colleague Jeff does have that mindset. But interestingly, the trend in the last few decades has been for deans and provosts, and particularly presidents, to not last in these jobs in one institution for very long. The American Association of Colleges and Universities, which represents hundreds of institutions, mostly American, but including everything from small liberal arts colleges to R1 research universities like Duke and Stanford, did a study in 2017 that showed that 45% of American presidents in that association didn't last longer than 4 years in one institution, and only 20% lasted longer than 10. So that's very short term to be able to think in the long term. And it's likely the same or worse maybe in Canada. And add to that there are enormous pressures from outside forces like governments and donors and industry, markets, the media, higher ed analysts, parents, the general market for students, to react to whatever the crisis or trend is of the moment. And it puts pressure on us to think long term. And while we certainly must be flexible and we can't ignore the present moment, and certainly we can't ignore the future, it's incumbent upon all of us to protect the central mission, which is academic, of the institution, and never stop thinking about the long-term health and trajectory of the university. And to me, the group that can protect best against short-term or finite thinking is the faculty and the academic staff. As a body, the faculty are the enduring element of the institution. The membership may change, but it does so slowly, but there is always continuity. And this has a downside as well, because it can allow grievances and trauma to be inherited and become part of the DNA of an institution. But generally, I think it's a strength to be valued. So as leaders, we can lament the grindingly slow pace of change at our universities and the complexity and difficulty of following through on collegial governance practices. But it is incumbent upon us to work with the collegium to make the changes that are needed to ensure long-term health and endurance. So collegial governance for me is vital, and short-circuiting it is not in the long-term interests of the university.
I wanted to actually preface my general remarks with a question that I wrestle with myself quite often, which is how should we approach the discussion of collegial governance or shared governance in the first place? Because oftentimes the discussion itself is a tense one. Faculty are speaking truth to power often in senates and GFCs and faculty councils and so on. There's inherent positional power differences in those settings, and often that's not an easy thing to do. And so because the discussion can be tense, it sometimes runs the risk that it can go off the rails, or that people's perspectives can be misconstrued and so on. And so, I think that part of the issue in the room is often that, there is the opportunity for faculty and administration to work together, but there's also some natural tensions that I wanted to talk a little bit about. And I think that'll maybe help inform how we can approach the discussion. And that's not to say that there aren't, of course, representatives of non-academic staff and students in the room as well. Of course, very important voices as part of the overall campus community. But administrators and faculty tend to be the largest constituencies that would say make up an academic senate, or in Alberta, what we call a general faculties council. I would say that it's important to recognize that there are inherent structural tensions as universities are currently structured and organized, inherent structural tensions in governance settings. And so it's important that we don't ignore those tensions. It means that sometimes when faculty especially are put in the position of critiquing governance practices at their institutions, that they can often be positioned as grandstanding or as a few loud voices. They can be perceived as rude or disrespectful. And I think that, that's a natural or almost unavoidable consequence, I think, of the way the system is currently structured. I would say that, on an individual level, I have worked with many academic administrators, whether I was doing governance work or academic staff work, and I have rarely met an administrator who one-on-one I could not have a good conversation with and do productive work with. Jeff Keshen and I did, I think, among others, did great work, for example, as part of MRU's academic planning process. 6 or 5 years ago or so now. We can have really productive conversations and do lots of good work together. So a lot of the governance we do with each other is with each other. But again, I think it would be a mistake to ignore some of the tensions that arise, and in fact, that there's inherent struggle as well. Governance is often a place of struggle for control of the university, and that does play out in administrator and faculty interactions. But I think when we have these kinds of conversations, I think it's important to be tough on structures, to be critical of structures, but to be kind to individuals. Because ultimately, I'd like us to be able to build as much solidarity as we can, recognizing there are some limits to that, and that I think we we avoid the easy mistake of falling into characterizing these structural problems as individual moral failings of people we disagree with. So despite the fact that there's, some ideological things maybe we'll get into. What is governance about, generally speaking? Well, I think governance in general is about setting the overall policy for a particular organization. It's about the high-level aspects of planning for the organization. And it's about oversight of the operations. So governance bodies don't manage the operations themselves, but they do expect that those that are hired to fulfill management roles are overseeing the operations in line with general plans that we've established and policies that we have established. How that plays out academically at a university is quite interesting because as Jeff Keshen alluded to, this is divided bicamerally between a board of governors typically that's responsible for the matters of financial planning, approving budgets, campus master planning, facilities, and so on, the hiring and evaluation of the president and so forth, of senior management, whereas academic policy and planning is really more the purview of General Faculty's Council in Alberta or academic senates across the country. And so when I think of governance, I tend to think especially of academic policy and who ultimately develops and approves it. Who has a voice in academic planning, and that includes budgeting, because what is a budget but a plan set in financial terms? Who has a voice in search processes and evaluating our administrators, including vice presidents and presidents, and the extent to which bodies like senates are able to get regular reports from the administration that paint a clear and full picture of what's going on, with the ability for the Senate as well as the board to hold those administrators accountable, and for the Senate to provide recommendations to the board on any matters that the Senate might consider to be maybe not legally within its purview, but of interest to the university and its overall academic mission. So that's what governance is about, including in an academic context. For governance to be collegial, what is important is that the academic staff of the institution participate fully in the institutional processes that shape the conditions of their academic work. If academic staff can't participate fully in the conditions that shape their academic work, then that academic work will be fundamentally undermined or compromised. The reason for that is, I think that universities have to be viewed not as ivory towers, not as set apart from or above the communities in which they are situated. Universities are embedded. They're complex systems that are embedded within a wider world, a local community and beyond. So there are internal logics, and there are internal interests, and there are internal disciplinary concerns that have to be somewhat safeguarded and respected and allowed to move in whatever directions those avenues of inquiry and study take them, and somewhat protected from undue external influence. But the university also has to remain responsive to and aware of its external conditions, because the community which a public university serves also has to be aware of any logics at play externally, external interests, whether they be things that we agree with or not. And that tension is always going to color how governance plays out. So maybe we can get into some of those details as we go. I think I'll end by saying, touching on the three questions broadly. Is there an acute governance crisis in Canadian PSC right now? I'm not sure I would frame it that way. I think there are a series of ongoing and long-standing problems which tend to recur and come to heads regularly. And I think there are certainly, at least in Alberta, where Dan and I are, and where Jeff has been, there are certainly very vigorous attempts to undermine the public mission of universities as many of us understand them, and to subordinate them to particular private interests. So there are certainly recurrent problems and maybe some acute issues we're facing now. And I'll end by saying that academic staff associations, of which Robin and I are members, absolutely have a fundamental role in protecting and strengthening and fostering good shared governance on our campuses. That's not a conflict. That is an essential part of making sure that the academic job can do its work in the service of society as it's intended to. So that includes both through advocating for and trying to secure better structures through collective bargaining, through advocating for changes to legislation and so on, advocating for changes to institutions' bylaws, but also through fostering the widespread faculty capacity to participate in those structures to their fullest extent.
The question about is there a governance crisis in post-secondary education has been partially answered in some responses. I know people have material prepared. As we go through the order here, we've got Robin, Jeff Hennessey, Marc, and Jeff Keshen, which I think will actually work very well since it's changing the order around. And so I'll throw the floor open to you, Robin. For all of our speakers, we're about 10 after 11. And so what we'll do is we'll keep it moving. I think characteristics of good governance and making governance even better or better are things that I think haven't come through necessarily in the opening statements, and so it would be nice to get there as well. Robin, you're up.
I had contemplated whether I wanted to use slides today, and I had found a great image for this question on crisis, which was a post from McKinsey and Company with the title, "Never Let a Good Crisis Go to Waste." And I thought that those in Alberta might appreciate that, but I decided not to use slides. So there you go. So is there a governance crisis in post-secondary education? I've already said, I think we should be cautious about that framework. That's not to say there aren't some bad things going on. And this is where the structural relationship that Marc spoke about is going to come to the fore a bit. And also, again, these are things we've been hearing about in the CAUT. So to name a few issues that have been recurring, what gets called the corporatization of public universities and colleges is reflected, I think, in often inadequate transparency in decision making and disproportionate demands for secrecy. We all know about secret presidential searches, but this is sometimes cropping up in routine kinds of committee work, governance, routine governance, ideas about board loyalty that are at odds with the needs of public post-secondary education, the role of outside consultants in core institutional activities, and so on. A variation on that theme, intensified managerialism and administrative dominance in decision making, and that sometimes manifests as an attempt to dominate or even bypass Senate on decisions that are definitely relevant to academic issues. I was contacted about two pretty egregious ones just yesterday. Sometimes inadequate or hollow forms of consultation on vital institutional decisions. And then, something that Jeff Hennessey mentioned, the rapid turnover in the academic administrative class, which, to those of us on the faculty side often feels like administrators who are more attached to their administrative careers than to any institution, and who are ready to leave for the next opportunity as soon as the opportunity arises, with a consequent proliferation of acting and interim appointments and a kind of chaos that comes from that for those of us left on the front line, so to speak. But then finally, also faculty disengagement from or inability to participate in collegial processes. So having said all that, I think that we should at the same time resist thinking about these problems solely in crisis terms. The anthropologist Joseph Moscow has suggested that the way that the idiom of crisis has dominated 21st century politics in a way that's worked as a conservative modality, directing attention to immediate threats to stability rather than to reimagining the future in more positive ways through an activation of collective energies. We're always putting out fires, not thinking about where we want to go. So said another way, setting the problem of governance in terms of crisis, it can usefully alert us to problems and redouble our determination to make things better. And certainly there are times when we need a rapid response to an emerging problem, but thinking only in terms of crisis implies that we're seeing situation normal gone wrong. Janet Reutman suggests in her book Anti-Crisis that sometimes the problems we face are actually a matter of things working to design. And that's not to suggest, that this is all a conspiracy, although there clearly sometimes are focused attempts to seize control. It's to point to the importance of doing what we're doing right now, which is comparing notes so that we can identify the systemic conditions supporting the immediate problems we're facing. Sometimes these demand fixes to governance as such, but others reflect the political, economic, and ideological conditions in which we work, and they require working on a broader front. For example, addressing issues of public services or public funding in post-secondary education and beyond. And I'll just end by mentioning Laurentian. It's hard not to engage in crisis talk when we think about what happened there, but I think the Auditor General report made clear that the events at Laurentian were certainly not a matter of things suddenly going off the rails.
I don't have a lot to say on this. I wouldn't say that it's governance. Maybe that's the problem in terms of our current moment. It's possible maybe the governance itself is misunderstood, and I can talk a bit more of that when we get to good governance and the distinction between governance and management. And I think knowing where governance ends and management begins is important. I think we also have to recognize that collegial governance is messy and it takes time, and we need to be patient with it and value it. I'm going to be careful saying this, but I do think, though, there might be an issue with leadership generally. And this is not to disparage my colleagues out there who do this work, and certainly not my other colleague, Jeff, who was on this panel. It is very hard work. But sometimes I think we're valuing the wrong things when we're selecting leaders. And this isn't just boards or administrators. I see a lot of faculty on search committees, for example, who I think also get this wrong. For example, I see a lot of search profiles for senior leaders stress a long and distinguished research record. And I ask why. Obviously valuing research is crucial, but the individual track record may not say much about the ability to work with others or to be a leader. In fact, individual performance stats don't reflect what we do in this job at all. In the past 2 years, I've hired 3 deans and several directors. And in all those cases, our search committees stressed empathy and compassion and team working ability and the ability to include voices that have previously been left out. And none of the people that we hired were the most experienced and didn't have the longest CVs of accomplishments, but their talents were in their ability to empower other people to perform. And, I challenge you to find a better group in this space. We need people like that who delight in the success of others, want to champion their work, and who are happy to be the support for others to thrive. And we actually need people in this work who enjoy the messiness of collegial governance. I find it really challenging and fascinating and endlessly stimulating. It's a part of this work that's unique and interesting. And if you can make it work and move the institution in a particular positive way, then I think there's a lot of fulfilling aspects of that. So we might be at a kind of tipping point in higher ed where we have to start thinking about leadership differently and what the role of leaders are in universities and how that works with our collegial governance processes and value maybe different leadership profiles.
I'm not sure that I would characterize the situation we're in now, the moment we're in now, as a moment of unique crisis. Or maybe crisis at all. As I said in my opening remarks, there are a series of long-standing problems that recur and that we continue to deal with today. I would start by saying there's never been a golden age of university governance, just like there's never been a golden age of the university. There's no perfect past in which everything worked smoothly and that we have deviated from. Universities have always been places of contestation. They've always been places of power. They've always been places of hierarchy and inequity, and they continue to be that. But they're also places of tremendous potential for the public good. And so our challenge is to always be doing the work which will be never ending. To try to get us closer to that ideal. It's like sweeping the floor, right? You'll never sweep the floor and be done for the rest of eternity. Some of the long-standing problems we can point to, to see that these are long-standing problems, all you have to do is go back, if you're a governance nerd like me, and read the Duff-Berdahl report, which was commissioned by the Canadian Association of University Teachers and the body that's now called Universities Canada. It was called AUCC when the report came out, but commissioned by both of those bodies to review university governance structures in Canada, the health of governance, and to come up with a series of recommendations. And the world has changed since the mid-60s. So some of it doesn't quite read as, some of it hasn't aged in a way that would make it still applicable, but a lot of it is, a lot of the tensions, including concerns around how Senates operate, for example, and the fact that they are often viewed by many on them as ineffective rubber stamping bodies at best. Those are longstanding concerns. Those haven't gone away. I would point to a few other things. Robin mentioned the fact that we are often in Canada, not always, dealing with closed administrative searches without an open finalist phase. And I think that is inappropriate for a public university that at least is nominally collegially governed. We do need to be conducting searches with open finalist phases, and I think we can talk about that a little bit more in the next part of the discussion. Jeff Hennessey mentioned the issues around high turnover at the administrative level. Not that administrators are in many cases taking on administrative secondments and then returning to the ranks of faculty, although that does happen, but very often they leave because they've moved on to the next administrative post after maybe not even completing a full 5-year term and move from university to university. And I think we have to be critical about that. I think that has combined with high salaries and many privileges that accompany the role. I think that's created a divide between the academic workers of the institutions and the people who have moved on in many cases to join the ranks of a disconnected administrative class who may be more connected to their career progression in many cases than to the institutions which they are supposed to be leading. Another longstanding problem is the regular sidelining of academic governance bodies like Senates, being replaced by administrative working groups and the like, or special ad hoc provost councils and that sort of thing. And that couples really nicely with what we often hear on university campuses from administrators, which is a push for expedience. And I quite like Jeff's comment that in fact, governance can be messy and slow. I've never found the perfect analogy for it. It's sometimes like a herd of cats. It's sometimes like a glacier. Maybe it's a glacier made up of frozen cats. I have no idea. Democracy is messy. Democracy is slow, but collegial governance at its heart is about democratic governance of our institutions. So expedience cannot be the primary criterion for determining whether it's effective or not. I can talk a little bit about specific problems in Alberta. Before I do that, though, I just wanted to highlight something that hasn't been mentioned yet, which is the vast over-reliance of precariously employed academic staff at universities across Canada. My university, Mount Royal University, relies on contract academic staff, many of them employed on 4-month per course contracts to teach the majority of the teaching of the credit instruction, whether you measure it by contact hour or by number of registrants. And we know by surveying our own members that those members are in large part colleagues who are seeking to cobble together the equivalent of a full-time, long-term academic career out of piecemeal work. That is now the norm at Canadian universities, at least based on the data that we have in Canada so far, which is insufficiently collected, and that needs to change too. So we can't talk about real meaningful shared collegial governance of our universities if we don't tackle the problem that many of our colleagues work on, do piecework, where they're not compensated for service, including governance, and often don't have a voice, and are not compensated for maintaining their research and so forth. But yeah, acute problems in Alberta. I could go on about this for a long time. The current provincial government's Alberta 2030 plan, which is very explicitly to transform universities and colleges in the province so that their programs are more narrowly aligned with specific labor market demands, the demands of private sector employers, and that research is much more tightly aligned with generating intellectual property that can then be appropriated by the private sector for profit. And this has been rolling out through massive austerity and funding cuts to our institutions, about $500 million per year cut from campus operating grants across the province. That's per year. The introduction of performance-based funding, which ties up to 40% of that remaining operating money to satisfying government's performance criteria that are set by the ministry. The replacement of general operating funding with much smaller pools of targeted funding, both for programs and research, but also for student aid. So students are being shoehorned, in particular, as tuition rises, into the kinds of programs that that governments favor, so that they can feed labor market needs. These are all ways in which the university is actually increasingly subordinated to private interests and to so-called market demands, and we're seeing that play out daily in the debates around governance on our campuses. Because if universities are subject to those kinds of very intense external pressures, there's very little room left for the kinds of internal disciplinary directions of inquiry and study that I alluded to in my initial remarks.
I would say that all the issues that have been identified here, we struggle with that in management. We really do. Government funding as proportion of operating grants have gone down. In Regina, we not only have the issue of so many courses being taught by precarious workers, precarious professors, but it's even compounded by the fact that being in Regina, we have trouble often finding the people to do that work, because it's like being in Corner Brook. There's often nobody to teach those courses. So if you're not offering the proper incentive for them to come, I would just say that for me, what I found over the years is the problems are huge, and communications is the key. And I would also go back to what my colleagues said. We all recognize what the issues are. I'm dealing with them right now, and to be frank, to be transparent about them, to be honest about them. And I remember when we were doing planning at Mount Royal, and I'm guilty of this myself, and I think a lot of administrators are, is we want things to happen lickety-split, and we want them to get done. And I was reminded by some fantastic colleagues there, that having the time and showing the commitment and really listening and being sincere will really bring you to a better result. And I think that I take the same approach, and I think we all should take the same approach in recognizing that we're all human and we should all have that interactions, and our board needs to not be secret. We all benefit from our board being out there and being visible. We all benefit from having really meaningful and less territorial and less defensive discussions around the table. And that we have to be mindful, and we have to be ready to be reminded when we're not doing our job well, and we have to have proper consultation. I think that is absolutely key in all areas. So I will end it there by saying that we all recognize these problems are huge. We wrestle with them. We have the immediate problem of reporting to try to get back to a balanced budget on an institution which has suffered tremendously out of COVID and has the targeted funding issue that you mentioned, Marc. I mean, we recognize those things are happening as well. And we're having to deal in different arenas and different tables and try to balance all that. I think we need to be very frank, honest, open, and work together on this, and not see each other as enemies in this process. We all lose if we do.
What are the characteristics of good governance in the post-secondary sector, and what is the purpose of governance, perhaps as opposed to management, or anything else that you can think of that might be confused or might be usefully set off in opposition?
I think for me, it's just important to distinguish that, governance and even leadership, which I think is a much bigger topic, but governance and leadership really aren't the same as management. And, as professionals, we're all managers of something, probably, right? Research labs or grants, or if it's a department, a program, a classroom, a faculty, an institute, leadership team, everybody has some kind of management responsibilities. And really that's the day-to-day decision making, the often dull and dreary actions of whatever your office is. And then depending on your role in the organization, you may have more or less management responsibilities. And so I believe it's always wise to consult when making operational decisions, but that's not the same as collegial governance. Governance is that larger level that sets the policies and the overall frameworks for the managing, right? Managers have to have some scope to make decisions without invoking a democratic process all the time. If managers are also leaders, then they will consult and they have a good understanding of the desires and the concerns of the group. But, as a provost, I can't call a Senate meeting every time I have to make a decision, for example, because that would freeze the university into inaction. So what Jeff was talking about in terms of the timeline, there are some decisions that do have to be made quickly. That's the management stuff. The stuff that takes a longer time, the stuff that we should really take time to gel and kind of germinate and really have a sense of where the university wants to go. That's the governance puff stuff that sets the higher level frameworks. I think if we keep those things distinct, and we have strong governance that provides clear guidelines, policies, and frameworks, and then we have managers who are also leaders that can have discretion and scope to make decisions, then I think that clear distinction probably is the way it should be and gets us out of some of the trouble that we get into sometimes.
Yes, governance is not management. They are obviously related, but not the same thing. At the risk of oversimplifying it, management is about operational decision-making and the allocation of resources. Governance is about its oversight, providing general direction, the setting of policy within which operational decisions would be made, or the high-level planning within which operational decisions would be made. And the way I tend to view it is that, of course, there's a strange kind of lopsided, maybe unbalanced kind of hierarchy or structure, which is, of course, we have management, of course, led by the president. Sitting beneath management, at least on an org chart, you would have non-management employees, be they regular academic staff, non-academic staff. But sitting over top of management, including the president, would be the main bicameral governance bodies of the university, which should be the Senate, or in Alberta, the GFC, together with the Board of Governors. And even though I, as an individual employee in the Department of Mathematics and Computing, have my dean as my immediate manager, and above my dean is the provost, and above the provost is the president. As an individual, I'm beneath them within a management structure. But a couple of things that are interesting here is that as a member of my GFC, collectively GFC has to be over top of the administration. But what I often witness, I call it a governance inversion, whereby the employees who make up those bodies on a Senate often are turned upside down and such that the GFC is actually subordinated in many ways. And I think we always have to watch out for that, tendency to flip upside down. Collectively, the academic community needs to be holding administration to account. As I said earlier, that governance has to be collegial, which means that the second part of what makes universities unique is that academic staff, hopefully as part of their collective agreements, have academic freedom provisions. So that they have rights to participate in collegial governance structures under the law and under their CAs. And they have the right to be critical of the university and its management and its administration. They have what we often call intramural academic freedom. So they can participate in that governance role and maybe be less susceptible to that kind of governance inversion that I described earlier. For senates in particular to be effective, they can't be starved of information. They have to be receiving regular reports about the state of the university, its operations. They have to be receiving regular information about its budget and finances, about the health of its faculty and non-academic academic staff complements, and so on. Oftentimes, those kinds of regular reporting don't happen. And that's necessary because when the administration comes to a Senate or a Board of Governors before planning gets underway or before policy is amended or developed, the administration needs to seek direction from those bodies. Those bodies should be setting the overall planning directions. I agree with Jeff Hennessey that administrators can't be running to boards or senates before making any operational decisions. That's not possible. But general direction should be sought from and obtained from those bodies. Those bodies should be consulted regularly as policy development and planning unfold. And it shouldn't just be the case that those come to those bodies only for final decision making at the end. We see that happen all too often. And ultimately, Senates have to be in the position to be able to make informed recommendations to boards of governors on all matters that they view as being of interest to the university. But by keeping Senates and senators deprived of that kind of information and role, oftentimes that's one way that Senates, in fact, become ineffective. The last thing I'll say is that universities play a really special role, important role in our society, and they have to be connected yet autonomous, right? So aware of the communities in which they're embedded, aware of the interests, aware of the needs, both educational and in terms of knowledge production and so on, but autonomous in that those internal disciplinary logics that I discussed can play out. And so to the extent that universities are not collegially governed or governed in a shared way, a democratic way, they can't be autonomous in the way that allows them to fulfill their most fundamental responsibilities to our publics, to our many publics.
Actually, I'm going to take a little bit of a different track. We can all agree on this. This is absolutely the way universities should run. But here's another point. I'm just going to put it out to maybe others to respond. Maybe not Jeff Hennessey, but perhaps Robin and Marc. I've been at GFC. I was at Senate at one, and I run the EOC I chair it. I don't run it. I chair it, and they overturn stuff. By the way, quite a bit. Is that I'm sort of the maestro, and then it proceeds. How many people do you think come having read the documents? That's an issue as well. And it's an important one. If our colleagues, and they should be involved in the university, I bring forward issues on the budget. I try to be as transparent and as detailed and so forth as I possibly can. And on academic programs as well, we rip through probably creation of, and same thing at Mount Royal, I was there as well. We rip through stuff fast, and Marc, Robin, I know you read that stuff, but I would say most folks don't read it. And then we get a few voices, as you know, that are around the table that raise concerns, and it's not particularly influential because most people don't want to get involved in the collegium, and most people don't really find themselves informed. So that's my comment on good governance. It has to go both ways, and I'd be curious about your challenges in this regard. Administration needs to be transparent. It needs to be engaged. It needs to be. You folks need to be engaged as well.
I think we're kind of modeling some of the things we need to be doing more routinely here. And so I really appreciate that. I think your question in a lot of ways speaks best to the final question on, how can we make governance better? So I might just bracket my thoughts on that till we get there, but I agree. I mentioned one of the challenges in my answer to the first question on is there a crisis is faculty disengagement from or inability to participate in collegial processes, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. And I think that's where I think the crisis framework doesn't help us out very much, because we need to be analyzing those kind of longer, slower, systemic issues that have created the kind of situation we're in, where I think, many people are quite happy with a division of labor where they can just focus on their research and not be as actively involved. And so that's something for us to talk about and think about. I think probably in the last question, I wanted to say on the characteristics of good governance, I was going to crib from the CAUT policy statement on collegiality. So for those of you who know it, my apologies, but I think that it provides a good set of reminders about markers of good collegial governance. These in some ways echo what people have said already, but adherence to the principles of democracy, procedural fairness, and transparency, space for diverse views and opinions. And we don't get as diverse a set of views always as we should. And that can mean disagreement and conflict at times, but we shouldn't see that as necessarily a problem, but as really critical to doing this well. Safeguarding the right of all participants to participate so that power differentials don't bring undue advantages. inclusiveness, ensuring that everyone who should be participating has the opportunity to do so, and a meaningful opportunity. The issue of precarity that Marc mentioned is really critical there. And finally, good governance has to be secured by the twin conditions of academic freedom and equity. And then, just to say that collegial governance means the active involvement of academic staff in decision-making about all the issues that matter to the academic mission of the public university and college. As Jeff Hennessey and Marc Schroeder both said, that doesn't mean we need to be involved in, every decision about operational matters. That would just be a waste of time and resources. But it does, mean working through processes and according to principles that reflect the distinct nature and demands of public institutions, including the central role of public education in democratic life more broadly. And I really do believe that we can't fulfill that role without being committed to ensuring that our own institutions embody the principles that we would like to see, the democratic principles that we would like to see more broadly.
On to the last question for the discussion, which is how can we make governance in Canadian post-secondary better? And the order I have this time is Marc, Jeff Keshen, Robin, and Jeff Hennessey.
I mean, this is something that the Canadian Association of University Teachers has made a priority over the last few years. Well, longer than that, but it's I would think it's fair to say that we've heard increasingly from members that governance concerns are something they would like CAUT to provide more resources on, more guidance on, and so on. So we know this is of interest across the country. I would go back to something that I touched on briefly in my introductory remarks and don't have much time to elaborate on it. But that's that it's not enough to have good legal structures, for example, for governance. It's not enough to have, and don't get me wrong, our governing acts, our governing charters of our universities matter, the language there matters, how the Board of Governors is constituted matters, and so forth. So we do need, we do need good legislation. We do need good board and Senate bylaws. We do need good collective agreements, but just modifying the formal structures or improving the formal structures of governance is not enough. What's fundamentally important is that that members of the academic staff, as well as students and anyone else who participates in governance, have to have the capacity to participate, and that capacity has to be built. That I'll take faculty as an example. Graduating from a PhD program and getting a position as, for example, an assistant professor at a university means that you're ready to begin teaching in your field, and you've got you're an established or an emerging researcher in your field. It does not necessarily mean that you understand governance, and it doesn't mean that you understand all of the policy details and all of the minutiae that make universities run. And that capacity needs to be built. And I think it needs to be built collectively among those groups of people. I think maybe administrations can proactively help to build that capacity. But to touch on the inherent structural issues I mentioned earlier, there are reasons why, with all due respect to the Jeffs on the panel, it's not really always an administrator's best interest to build the kind of critical capacity that I think faculty serving on senates and faculty councils need. So that needs to be done organically at the faculty level, at the academic staff level, at the worker level, and that's where academic staff associations have a clear role to play in fostering that process. Academic staff associations can be can plant the seed crystals around which a more organized and higher capacity academic staff can be built to participate in those settings. There are clear workload issues as well that get in the way of the ability to, read a 300-page Senate agenda that you get 7 days before the meeting and so on. So those are issues too. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that people are prepared and collectively can cooperate with their colleagues at Senate meetings and prepare and so on.
Yeah, I found, Marc, your comments really helpful. I agree with you. I don't think our colleagues are prepared, and I think that would be a real step forward. And we should explore that substantially to give them the space to to participate in collegial governance and the importance of collegial governance, because having our colleagues engaged provides for better results at the end, because we don't want a few voices being able to determine the course of events. We want everybody involved. We don't want people silent. The other thing that I would have picked up from this is that I go back to very wise advice that I was given at Mount Royal by a colleague of ours. And when I was talking earlier about the importance of transparency and relationships and making sure, I do think now, thinking about it, it's more than that. I do think we need stronger bylaws to ensure that steps are taken. I remember this individual told me that you and I can have a good relationship, but eventually we all will move on, retire or whatnot. So I think we need the structures in place to ensure that consultation, that proper engagement, so we don't trip ourselves up by fast forwarding things. That's another thing that I would point to. And I know that when I was preparing my remarks, I was looking more specifically at the board. And what I was trying to get that before is that whereas we can't discuss everything at the board, because a lot of that deals with very confidential matters, not secretive, but I'm thinking we discuss sometimes some HR related matters. I don't think we can discuss the details, but certainly I think we could, giving our faculty member the means to say that this was discussed and it was discussed fully, and I'm satisfied the due process was followed. So I don't want us to be in a situation where these bodies are seen as something separate. And I also agree with both of you. Whereas I was hired by that secretive process, full disclosure, we have gone for all our VP positions. And when the new Jeff Keshen is here, I think it should be an open process. In fact, we have not seen people shy away from that. And it's been good for our faculty as well. We, interestingly, by the way, just the last point I'm going to make, we don't get huge audiences for it, which again, I'm surprised at it, but maybe that's just a thing right now that I just don't quite understand why, but certainly it's an open process.
We do need to focus on the core issues in our own institutions and on the wider conditions that are affecting the kind of workplace it's possible to be in a university. And that means from the union side, I think working in the wider labor movement with a commitment to bargaining for the common good, understood broadly, because ultimately, we are public institutions, and our ability to address some of the issues that are making it difficult for people to participate, whether it's precarity, overwork, all of those things, depends on our ability to secure the kind of support that our institutions need to thrive and to be healthy, and not to be, continually sort of lurching from what feels like a crisis to another crisis. So that's one thing. I think that I was going to start on the faculty side. I'm going to start on the administrator side from the faculty perspective, and bear in mind that we're facing a strike situation here, so it's fairly adversarial. I do think that it's helpful to see real demonstrations of good faith, and this panel is one. And I think Jeff Keshen's comments just now, welcoming open searches, are another one. I mean, it's excellent to hear that willingness to move and to change things, maybe change them back. My union is proposing to include the following definition of collegial governance in the collective agreement. Collegial governance shall mean rights, privileges, and responsibilities of ASMs, that's academic staff members, to fully participate in the university, including collegial processes as set out in Senate regulations, guidelines, policies, and decisions, and in institutional systems of peer review and decision-making processes specified by this collective agreement and in accordance with the Act. And the administrative side in bargaining is refusing to allow that definition into the collective agreement, which is, to me, I'm just flabbergasted. I mean, what are they afraid of? That doesn't seem radical to me in any sense. It seems like a basic condition of allowing us to participate meaningfully. So just to turn to the faculty side, and this I think is where we get to some of the questions Jeff Keshen was asking. There's the basic nuts and bolts stuff. And one thing that the CAUT is thinking about doing, and partly through the governance committee, is organizing a workshop that would help train faculty members on how to participate in, how to be a senator. For instance, the thing about reading the documents and how you might do that and preparing for meetings, though being an effective participant. So I think that basic training and education is important. There's a lot of people across the country already working hard to defend and improve collegiality. We shouldn't forget that kind of routine work that's also really important, exercising our intramural academic freedom on a daily basis, going to faculty council and asking good questions, organizing a Senate caucus, all that kind of stuff. I would say we also need to think reflexively about our workplaces and the conditions of our work. And so that does mean, you know, fighting for a stronger complement of academics whose positions involve the holistic job, and thinking critically about the hegemonic role of meritocracy in our institutions. That's often a self-justifying ideology. We're where we are because we're so great. Well, I hate to break it to you, but you know, we need to, I don't think that we can improve governance if we don't take that kind of critical reflexive role. And I think also, you know, again, maybe getting partly at some of the issues raised, we do need to think about how we assess our colleagues in promotion and tenure and the language that we have in our collective agreements, and really see, you know, those three parts of the holistic job as really integrally related to one another: teaching, research, and what gets called service, but should probably better be called collegiality or governance work. And so that needs to be valued, but not siloed.
And I say this with full respect to the fact that there are very difficult negotiations happening in my end of the country right now, or certainly in your university, Robin, and a strike just started today. And you know, I'm about as pro-faculty, pro-union and administrators you'll find. But I will push back a little bit on Marc and Robin, though I totally understand why you have the view that you do. But from where I sit, it's important to distinguish for me that collegial governance is absolutely the purview of the faculty, but really shouldn't ideally be the responsibility of the union. And I admittedly, the Venn diagram overlap between those two bodies in terms of membership is near congruent. I get that, but quite distinct it should be in terms of role and identity. In an ideal world, the union would have the job of negotiating a collective agreement every 2 or 3 or 4 years, whatever, and really should try to get as much as you can for your members. That's the way that unionism and trade unionism is supposed to work, and then protect that agreement until the next negotiation. And that, you know, is more short-term thinking, but that is totally fair and proper, but that's not really how governance works. So, and another way, a more pro-union way to think about that is that collegial governance shouldn't be negotiable. It actually shouldn't be something that we have to get into collective bargaining to protect, because it should be endemic into the institution. It should be, as well as academic freedom. Those are values that we should have in the institution and shouldn't need to be part of negotiations. So, I mean, a good university leadership team will always consult the union on any matter relating to changes or issues in the work environment, but that's not the same as collegial governance. The union itself doesn't have a role on senates or faculty councils or program development or even leadership appointments, but the faculty very much does. And so to me, that's a very important distinction. But I totally understand that what happens is that when senior leadership, or actually indeed members of the faculty, because faculty do this too, try to bypass or collegial governance because it's too slow or messy or won't guarantee the desired result, then the union has to step in to try to protect it as the only recourse for faculty, because faculty have two levers really of influence. They have collegial governance and they have collective bargaining. And if you're not going to respect collegial governance, collective bargaining steps in to try to take up the slack on that. And that's really unfortunate, because the collective agreement shouldn't be needed to enforce collegial governance, because collegial governance is in the best long-term interests of the university. And that should be a top priority of boards, administrations, and the faculty. So I think, you know, for me to make governance better, we need to all understand it, what it means, how it's applied, and respect it, even though it can be cumbersome and frustrating sometimes. And then it really shouldn't need to be part of the collective bargaining process. I understand why it is. It's just ideally it shouldn't have to be. And we also can't do good governance, I think, if we're always operating in an us versus them mindset, like we're each protecting something, but that something is different. You know, there's a question about our administrators misaligned in terms of what the academic mission is with the faculty. They definitely should not be, right? We should all be thinking about the same things and want the same things for the university, the long-term health of the university. So as an administrator, my contribution to good collegial governance is to not treat it like it's something to abide or with disdain, and to embrace faculty as necessary collaborators. And I have found that in my work at Mount Allison, that has tamped down the need for that to be part of a discussion with the union on matters like that. We're just doing it, and therefore we don't have to discuss it at the bargaining table. Now, I'm not in negotiations. We'll see what happens in a year or so when we get back to the table. But I haven't, I am doing what I can to make sure that we as a university understand that that's a key part of how we do things, and then and not to think that it's something that we need to negotiate every 3 or 4 years. And with thinking about in terms of language in a collective agreement, I mean, just the thing that if I was presented with an article like that, it's not that I would ever disagree with the idea. What we think about when we're in negotiations is what kind of grievances is that going to lead to? How is that going to be interpreted? If somebody decides that has been violated, what kind of grievances does that lead to? And so what we try to do is to have language that's very, very clear, so it doesn't get us into that trouble down the road and actually waste a lot of resources on legal fees and such. So I think that's part of what happens with when we put it as something really, really almost abstract, but extremely important and high level into a labor negotiation, is that it gets a little bit mucked up somehow. Again, not in every in universities is individual, but I think that's part of the trouble that we're getting into, is that we're being forced, not we are being forced by administration. As universities, we're being forced to have these discussions at the bargaining table when they should be actually just endemic to the function of the university.
Will say one thing on that last point, because I think it's a fascinating point. There's obviously a fair bit of I know a fair bit of disagreement within the union movement in Canada and post-secondary as well. It's something that we at the U of L have really worked, I think, and had really good, solid discussions back and forth about the union's relationship to governance. And I can tell you that I think where we currently are here is that the union's job is to do its best to create the space for people to be the best possible faculty members, which includes governance. And so, we do things like support governance body members to talk to each other on the explicit assumption that disagreeing with the union, if that's your feeling, is a good governance position. And so we're doing our job if we've created the space for you to disagree. But I think it's a really fraught issue as unionization has happened across the country, in the last couple of decades, and in Alberta, probably the last 5 or 6 years, we're really struggling, I think, learning that dual function of the faculty association.